everybody, what's up and welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Liz, your host here at Crimes Untold. And today we're going to do our true crime recap of the week. The week. Yeah, even you here, hey, I talk about some true crime. Yeah. So about that. First off, we're going to be talking about Scott Peterson. So Scott Peterson's case is being taken on by the Innocence Project of Los Angeles, not the regular Innocence Project, the Innocence Project of Los Angeles. Just so people don't get it twisted. So the Innocence Project of Los Angeles has basically decided to take up Scott Peterson's case 21 years after the death of his wife, Lacey, and their unborn son, Connor. So Scott Peterson, who is now 51 years old, has stated numerous times that he's innocent, and basically he maintained his innocence the entire time and said that he didn't get a fair trial and things like that. So there were certain court filings that happened this week, and it was released by ABC News that the Innocence Project of Los Angeles wants to take on Scott Peterson's case. Apparently, in this new court filing, there's evidence that shows just cause for his innocence, and that it apparently will raise eyebrows in regards to who actually took and killed Lacey and ultimately killed Connor. So if you have never heard of the Innocence Project of Los Angeles, what they do is they take on cases in which the wrongly accused are imprisoned and they help legally to exonerate them. Or basically they look at their case and they research it and all this jazz. So the only thing that has been released by them is that they stated they would take up his case to fully investigate it and to look into his claim of innocence, basically. Family members are not happy about the development in this case, both sides of the family, that is. One family member in particular went as far as recalling Scott being on his phone the entire time during the vigil for his wife and his son. Another family member from his side of the family said she believes he's guilty and that people are going to help him are the kind that just get railroaded. So if you don't know anything about the Lacey Peterson murder and the Connor Peterson murder, this is it. So Lacey Peterson went missing from the home that she shared with Scott in Modesto, California on Christmas Eve of 2002. At the time, she was 8 months pregnant with their first child, Connor, a boy. They would be missing for quite some time until the remains of Connor and Lacey would be found in the San Francisco Bay in April of 2003. So quickly, eyes were on Scott because in most cases, the husbands do it. It would be found out that Scott was having an affair with a woman named Amber Fry, who would end up coming forward publicly and claim that she was told by him that he was a widower, and basically that's how she took it. This would become the center of the case for the prosecution. The prosecution alleged that Lacey was smothered to death by Scott around Christmas Eve so he could be with Amber Fry, his mistress. It is also alleged that he took Lacey's remains on board his brand new boat and then dumped her in the bay. But what Scott alleges is different. So Scott's arrested after the discovery of Lacey and Connor. He says that he left Lacey alone, alive, on Christmas Eve so he could go on a fishing trip in Berkeley that morning. His legal team then would even present how Lacey was abducted and Scott was ultimately framed for the murder of his wife. This trial was highly publicized during 2004. I remember it so vividly. All the tabloids everywhere, movies, the interviews with Amber Fry. I remember seeing the commercials of, the mistress is coming out, his mistress is coming out, blah, 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 blah. So, the motive that was unveiled during the trial is that Scott tried to escape becoming a father in his marriage by killing Lacey and Connor. He would be found guilty with circumstantial evidence and very little forensic evidence. His death penalty, because he was sentenced to the death penalty, his death penalty was overturned in 2020, and it was commuted to life without parole. Yeah. What do you think about that? Leave it in the comment below. So next we're going to talk about is Jennifer Crumbley. I mentioned this before. Jennifer Crumbley and her husband are going to trial for involuntary manslaughter in connection to the Oxford school shootings. Opening arguments started on January 25th, 2024 for this trial, so 2 days ago. This is right after jury selection concluded on the 23rd, which was Tuesday. The jury is comprised of 10 women and 7 men. She asked for a separate trial, or they decided to separate for their trials. She is charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter in connection to the Oxford High School shootings that her son committed back in November of 2021. So her son, Ethan Crumbley, is serving a life sentence without parole for killing 4 students. Those students are Madison Baldwin, Tate Meyer, Hannah St. Juliana, and Justin Schilling, and he also injured 7 other students in these killings as well. So his parents basically stand accused of enabling their son by letting him have accessibility to a gun or to a firearm, refusing to pick up their son the day of the shooting when the school called them in regards to a discovery of some drawings that he had, and the drawings were violent in nature, and completely ignoring their son's mental health. So these parents are being made an example of, as they are the first set of parents to be charged in connection to a school shooting in the United States in which the perpetrator is their child. This is a way to hold parents and guardians accountable for their children's actions, which is very smart that the United States is, or in some cases, some states are actually, thinking with their brains. So Jennifer Crumbley has made 3 motions in connection to this trial. One was to have the video that depicts the day of the shooting not available to be broadcasted. The second one was to have a few of the eyewitnesses not testify, and the third one was to have her trial separate from her husband's. Now, obviously, the third one was granted, but the first 2 were not. And I'm sure that the intention of having her trial separate from her husband's means that she will either go after him or vice versa. They're going to go after each other. Unfortunately, in trials like this, these things happen, so no parent will have a lesser sentence than the other when it comes to trying them separately. Yeah, I'm very happy that they went after these parents. I mean, they vilified them through the media, but I'm really happy that they're holding them accountable for what their son did, because I don't know, whoever's watching this, I don't know your stance on these school shootings, but a lot of these perpetrators that commit these, a lot of it stems from their home life. So for them to basically be negligent when it came to the school calling them to come get him, completely ignoring the signs of his mental health and letting him have access to firearms, it's unacceptable. So next on our list, the last victim of the Green River Killer has been identified. So Bones 20, the second part of her has been positively identified. I know that sounds really weird, but this was released in a King County Sheriff's Office press release that the second part of her was positively identified as 16-year-old Tammy Lyles, or Tammy Lils. It's Liles. I'm going to say Lyles. So Tammy Lyles was actually identified as a victim back in 1988 when they connected her dental records to a partial set of remains, which was skull and part of the body, all skeletal, found in Tualatin, Tualatin, Oregon, and this is 3 years after the discovery of Bones 20. So the partial set of remains was found on April 23rd, 1985 in Tualatin, Oregon, and the remainder of these remains were actually discovered on August 21st of 2003 in Kent, Washington. So with the use of Othram and STR testing, they were able to conclude that Bones 20 was that of Tammy Lyles. This genetic test or testing had started back in 2022. But who is Tammy Lyles? You may be wondering. So Tammy Charlene Lyles was born on May 9th of 1967. So as she grew older, she was known to have completed sex work within her life, which makes me assume that she was a frequent runaway, as it was known that she ran away from her home in Snohomish County, Oregon, back in May of 1983. This was not the last time she was seen, though. She was last seen on June 9th of 1983, so just a month later, in Seattle, Washington, and she was working as a prostitute. She was ultimately reported missing in March of 1988, and her family didn't believe anything bad happened to her. She was reported missing after, I'll get to that in a second. So let's go back to the first discovery of the first set of remains. So on April 23rd of 1985, the remains of Angela Gardner, who is a suspected victim of the Green River Killer, not confirmed but suspected, she was discovered, as well as the skull and partial remains of Tammy Lyle. These were found in a wooded area across from the Tualatin Country Club on Southwest Tualatin Road. Or Tualatin? Tualatin? Tualatin. Tualatin. Apologies, I don't mean to offend anybody, by the way, I just pronounced that. But so people were walking in the general area and they found these two sets of remains, and that would eventually lead to the discovery of a total of 4 sets of remains within a mile's distance. So, and they were like within a mile of one another. So the first 2 were found, the first 2, obviously April of 1985, and then the second 2 were found in June of 1985. So the other 2 sets of remains were that of Denise Bush and Shirley Sherrill, 2 victims of the Green River Killer. The skull found in the first set matched the dental records of Tammy Lyles, and the other set of remains was that of Angela Gardner. Both girls went missing back in 1983. So in 1988, police take the missing persons report from Tammy's family. Then they were able to obtain her dental records that ended up positively identifying Tammy as one of the sets of remains found in 1985. And this happened in March of 1988. So her parents got some closure as to what happened to at least part of her. So, August 21st of 2003, the discovery of 25 to 30 more bones would be included in the recovery led by Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. So this was after Gary Ridgway confessed to murdering a woman that hadn't been found yet. This would be Bones 20. And ultimately, it would be proven in January of 2024 that Bones 20 was a remainder of Tammy Lyles, who was partially discovered in 1985. So Gary Ridgway would plead guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder and 1 count of solicitation. This was on November 5th of 2003. He was sentenced to life without parole, and he was able to avoid the death penalty by pleading guilty as long as he provided information in regards to women he killed and answering any questions detectives or the prosecution had, and this happened in June of 2003. So as of December 2023, there's only 1 victim without a name, and that was Bones 20. As of January 2024, just a few days ago, Bones 20 was positively identified as 16-year-old Tammy Lyles. So another good thing happened this week is that somebody that's been wanted in connection to the murderer's wife has been found after 30 years. So Jose Lazaro Cruz has been captured after 30 years on the run, and he's been wanted in connection to the murder of his wife back in 1991. Sorry, there's a stray hair. Anywho, earlier this month he was extradited back to the United States from Costa Rica. He was arrested back on July 29th of 2022 in Costa Rica, and he was extradited back to the U.S. on charges of murder for his wife. So back on April 30th of 1991, 24-year-old Ana Juardo, was found dead due to severe trauma to her upper torso in the street. Her husband, Jose Cruz, was identified as a suspect, and after this identification, he fled. So at first he tried to go into Canada, but he was unable to when they noticed he was using fake documents. Border Patrol also said that he had a fresh cut on his hand. So when he was trying to cross the border, they just nixed him. So this was also noted by the Deputy Chief of Investigation as well. Ultimately, after being smuggled out of the country, he made it to El Salvador, where he would remain until he tried to enter Costa Rica, but he was arrested. While in El Salvador, he had a whole new life, had more kids, even though he murdered his first wife and left his children without both parents. What a nice man. Next, we're going to discuss the Tropicana Jane Doe of 1993. She's been formally identified. So in April of 1993, a biologist stumbled upon a grave that was covered by a quilt that was handmade and some large rocks while researching the desert of Durango Drive and Tropicana Avenue. After this discovery, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department was called and they started investigating these remains. This was female of origin and it was ruled as a homicide. It also was determined that she died in mid to late 1991. This case was uploaded to NamUs as UP14396. After the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department teamed up with Othram, our lovely friends at Othram do amazing work. They were able to identify this Jane Doe as 38-year-old Linda Sue Anderson, who was last heard from in June of 1991. She went missing from Henderson, Nevada. Now, if you or anyone you know has any information, you can contact the homicide section of the LVMPD at 702-828-3521, or you can email them at homicide@lvmpd.com. If you want to be anonymous, please call 702-395-5555. So next is the Hernando County Jane Doe. So the Hernando County Jane Doe of 1972 has now been identified as well. She was identified as that of Peggy Joyce Shelton, whose murder is still currently being investigated. So while they were investigating her, she had a nickname of Edna. And this Jane Doe would be found on State Road 50 in a wooded area in Brooksville, Florida. Did I say Brooksfield? Brooksville. A teenage boy was just going along in an area close to the Withlacoochee, that is a real place, the Withlacoochee State Forest. This was on July 19th of 1972. She was kind of concealed underneath a bedspread that had a pineapple damask pattern on it that was brown and yellow. Super popular back in the 70s. It's kind of popular again, but it's believed that she was strangled to death either 3 or 4 days prior to her body being discovered. So she was last seen just a few days prior with two people in a Ford Falcon that was white and either a 61 or 62 model. They couldn't determine that. She and these people were going into the woods, and the group was thought to have come out without one person. So one person was missing from the group of three. It was thought as well that she had just come recently from northern Florida or Alabama. So the remains of this Jane Doe were exhumed for further testing. Sorry, my Dutch oven is not being nice. So she was exhumed to complete further testing, and this is when she would receive the nickname as Edna, like I mentioned earlier. They completed a facial reconstruction with the hopes that this would identify her. So back in 2022, a sample of her DNA would be sent to Othram, and in August of 2022, Othram would give the Hernando County Sheriff's Office a potential identity. So they then were able to confirm with familial DNA that this was Peggy Joyce Shelton from Kentucky, who was born back on March 30th of 1943. Her murder is still being investigated at this time, so if you or anyone you know has any information in regards to the murder of Peggy Shelton, please contact Detective George Lloydgren at 352-754-6830. And if you want to remain anonymous, you can call the Hernando County Crime Stoppers at 1-866-990-8477 or online at hernandocountycrimestoppers.com. All right, last but certainly not least, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of lethal injection and the death penalty. So if you don't follow me over on TikTok, I actually put it up as a short. I went down a strange rabbit hole of lethal injection. There's a whole lot to it. If you don't read into it, man, you won't understand it. So the reason why I did this is because somebody was just executed with a execution of the first, like them first doing it in the United States. It's something that they've done in Europe for assisted suicides, but it's called nitrogen hypoxia. So Alabama tried out nitrogen hypoxia for the first time Thursday. So this method is being used on a man named Kenneth Smith that had a botched execution back in November of 2022, of which he would have been number 4 in the span of 48 hours to have been put to death in November of 2022. That's wild. So his lethal injection failed because they struggled to correctly insert his IV before his death warrant expired at midnight. Why it took them so long, I don't know. But his lawyers were arguing for the new death penalty. He has obviously since been executed, but his lawyers were arguing that this new way of execution is cruel. It isn't. So this will be the second time in history to have a second execution attempt after the first one failed. Smith, or Kenneth Smith, that's his name, He was sentenced to the death penalty after he murdered Elizabeth Sennett back in 1988. So Kenneth Smith, so he did not want this death penalty. He wanted lethal injection. And he said that if this death penalty violated his right to be free of cruel and unusual punishment, which is the Eighth Amendment in the United States Constitution. So nitrogen hypoxia has never been executed on anyone in the United States before. Smith would and will be the first person executed via this method. So this method of which his lawyers call torture and cruel. Nitrogen hypoxia death penalty is when you have a mask that will have nitrogen gas flowing through it and which eludes you of oxygen. Virtually, it will suffocate you to death, much like the thought of shoving your head in an oven or sticking a tube from your tailpipe into your car. Not that any of us want to be like Sylvia Plath or like the girls from the Virgin Suicides, but this is an alternative death penalty that is being explored at the moment. Most states have lethal injection as their primary penalty, but there are some states that have an alternative, such as hanging, lethal gas, so a gas chamber, electrocution, or firing squad. So they have, Mississippi and Oklahoma have nitrogen hypoxia listed as a method of death penalty, but that is if the substances of lethal injection are not available, so the prisoner can choose nitrogen hypoxia. So when it comes to lethal injection, there is either a 1-drug or a 3-drug cocktail that's given to whomever is being executed. The 1-drug cocktail is pentobarbital or pentobarbital, and it's a sedative that is short-acting and causes death with respiratory arrest in high doses, like severe high doses. This is a part of the benzodiazepine family, like the different drug family, hence why it has the name pentobarbital or barbital, barbitone, things like that. So this method of pentobarbital was first used in 2011. This is after they stopped production of sodium thiopental. So sodium thiopental was what used to be used for lethal injection. They started using the 1-drug method more predominantly when there was a shortage also of pancuronium bromide. And this was on the 18th of July of 2012 in Texas. So pancuronium bromide is a muscle paralytic that is a part of the 3-drug cocktail. So the 3-drug cocktail is midazolam, which is a sedative. Potassium chloride stops your heart. And pancuronium bromide or Pavilon causes paralysis, so muscle paralysis. This dose is given in different variations. Sodium thiopental is also a barbiturate that's used for medically inducing comas. In some states, they actually have started using fentanyl with hydromorphone, midazolam, and sodium thiopental as a new way of lethal injection. Typically, the procedure is done with sedative paralytic heart stopper. It just makes it easier. So, why am I talking about this? I already introduced Kenneth Smith. So, Kenneth Eugene Smith, his execution started at 7:53 and he was pronounced dead at 8:25 p.m. on January 25th. So, Kenneth Smith was on death row, like I mentioned, for the murder for hire of Mrs. Elizabeth Sennett back in 1988. She was the wife of prominent preacher Charles Sennett Sr., and Kenneth Smith had a failed execution of lethal injection due to them not being able to properly inject it. And also, his death warrant expired. This second attempt was successful. The only thing is that he held his breath in order to avoid breathing in the nitrogen from his nitrogen hypoxia death sentence. So theoretically, he would have been incapacitated in seconds due to him holding his breath, he prolonged how fast the nitrogen would be inhaled, and he made it worse for himself. So during his execution as well, he was strapped to a gurney, and then he had the mask for the nitrogen that had the nitrogen line placed on his head. He was awake for several minutes prior to the gas flowing, and then it would deprive him of oxygen. Thus, he would be incapacitated, he would pass out, and it would be painless. So I briefly mentioned before, while talking about Alabama introducing this as a death sentence, this is a secondary death penalty that Kenneth Smith chose due to his failed lethal injection. So he chose this. He didn't want it, but he chose it. He also, his last meal, which people love hearing what the last meal of these people's are, is steak and eggs, hash browns, and it was covered in steak sauce. He wasn't allowed to eat after 10 a.m. to prevent vomiting, After this, he was in his death cell and he awaited his death, his impending death. So he also had a reverend with him. Reverend Jeff Hood was in the room with him to provide comfort for him. Witnesses also say that they could hear him gasping for air and that his body was shaking when he had the mask on and the nitrogen was flowing. The last words he said prior to them putting the stuff on was, "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards. I'm leaving with love, peace, and light." He would then give the "I love you" sign to his family and thank them for supporting him prior to them strapping him to the gurney. At 8:30, the governor of Alabama, Kay Ivey, confirmed that Smith was dead in the first execution of nitrogen hypoxia that was carried out in the United States at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama. So, I also have a fun fact for you. The day I put all this together was January 24th. Do you know what happened on January 24th of 1989? That was the day that Ted Bundy was electrocuted to death. His execution was, a thing in Florida, in the Florida State Prison. I thought that was very ironic because I was talking about the death penalty and literally scrolling, fun fact, Ted Bundy was executed on this day in 1989. What? Mind-blowing. I have so many thoughts when it comes to the death penalty. Obviously, I live in a state where my death penalty is not active. They abolished it. State of New Hampshire, our death penalty is hanging. The last noose that was used in the state is actually hanging in the state house. It's in a glass case. It's literally hanging in the middle of, like, you walk into the state house. Sorry, you can see all my extras again. You walk into the state house and bam, there's a noose. Yeah. I wish that our death penalty was still active. I believe in the death penalty. That's my own thoughts. You guys can have your own thoughts. What do you think about this? What do you think about nitrogen hypoxia? What do you think? There are some states that still have electrocution as their main form of death penalty. Florida is one of them. Their secondary is lethal injection. A lot of states, like Idaho, man, Brian Koberger is screwed if he has a death penalty case, because the death penalty in Idaho is lethal injection or firing squad. So, yeah. And then Chad Daybell, he has a death penalty case. So it's either lethal injection or firing squad for him. Yeah, what do you think? Leave them in the comments down below. I would love to know, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.